At the edge of charted waters lies an island shrouded in mist and whispered warnings. Captain Elias Blackwood, once the most feared pirate of the Spanish Main, washes ashore on its desolate beaches, a broken man with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his failures. His legendary fleet gone, his trusted crew betrayed him, his reputation shattered. The man who once commanded the respect of kings and the fear of nations now stands alone, haunted by ghosts of his past. But what could one ruined man possibly build in this godforsaken place that would change the course of history forever? The weathered compass lay broken in Elias Blackwood's palm, its needle spinning aimlessly, much like the man himself. 3 days had passed since the sea had unceremoniously deposited him upon these shores. 3 days of salt-crusted clothes, drying stiff on his broad frame, of parched lips cracking in the relentless sun. He tucked the useless instrument into his coat pocket. Once, this very compass had guided him through treacherous straits where naval warships dared not follow. Once, he had commanded a fleet of 7 ships, each captain hand-chosen for their cunning and loyalty. Or so he had believed. Blackwood dragged himself toward the tree line, his boots leaving deep impressions in the sand. The memories came unbidden. Standing tall upon the quarterdeck of the Raven's Revenge, his flagship's black sails striking terror into merchant vessels from Bermuda to Barbados. The wind in his face, the horizon endless with possibility, the holds below deck groaning with Spanish gold. "Water," he croaked to himself. "Find water or die, old man." The island rose sharply from the beach, a formidable wall of volcanic rock draped in vegetation. No gentle paradise, this. No wonder it remained unclaimed by colonial powers. Too difficult to cultivate, too treacherous to harbor ships, too remote to serve as anything but a landmark to avoid on nautical charts. Perfect for a man who wished to disappear. By midday, his hands were bloodied from climbing. Blackwood had scaled cliff faces before, usually with a knife between his teeth and revenge in his heart, but never with 60 years weighing down his bones. Never with the weakness of near drowning still plaguing his muscles. When he finally crested the ridge, the vista momentarily stole what little breath remained in his lungs. The island spread before him like an untamed emerald, its interior a jumble of valleys and peaks shrouded in mist. A thin ribbon of silver caught his eye. A stream, perhaps even a river, cutting through the jungle below. That night, huddled beneath the inadequate shelter of broad leaves, Blackwood sipped cautiously from a cupped handful of fresh water. His body demanded more, but experience had taught harsh lessons about overindulgence after deprivation. Small sips, patience. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, shelter, food, tools fashioned from whatever the island might provide. He slept fitfully, his dreams haunted by the faces of his crew, loyal men who had followed him for decades, their throats cut as they slept. The memory of waking to find First Mate Jenkins standing over him, dripping dagger in hand. Expression cold as a winter sea. The men want a captain who'll retire wealthy, not one who buries treasure that rightfully belongs to them, Jenkins had said. Nothing personal, Captain. Blackwood had fought like a cornered wolf, but even he could not overcome a dozen mutineers. They had granted him the mercy of the sea rather than a blade, tossing him overboard, far from any shipping lane. Certain the waves would finish their work. Dawn broke over the island, painting its harsh contours in soft gold. Blackwood rose stiffly, his body a catalogue of complaints. Age, injury, exhaustion, all demanded rest. All would be denied. "One foot before the other," he muttered, a mantra from his youth when he had been a ship's boy. Climbing treacherous rigging in howling gales, he fashioned a crude pack from his coat, filled it with fallen fruit that resembled nothing he recognized, but smelled sweet enough. The river would be his guide. Following it downstream would eventually lead to better terrain, perhaps even a suitable location for more permanent shelter. As he walked, Blackwood realized the island's hostility was, in its way, a kindness. It left no room for dwelling on betrayal, no space for self-pity. Survival demanded his full attention. a clarity of purpose he had not experienced since his early days as a pirate, before wealth and legend had complicated everything. By sunset, he had found his spot, a natural depression in the land near the river, sheltered on three sides by rock. With the right materials, it could become defensible, comfortable even. Not that there appeared to be anything on this godforsaken rock to defend against, except perhaps, Blackwood thought as he gazed up at the emerging stars, the ghosts of his past. The tattered naval map unfurled across a flat stone, its edges curling from saltwater damage. Blackwood had salvaged it from his coat lining, one of many hiding places a prudent captain maintained. Most of it remained legible, though the island he now inhabited appeared as little more than an ominous ink blot marked with a simple warning: treacherous waters, no proper name, no indication of fresh water or edible vegetation. Just a place sailors avoided. Blackwood traced a weathered finger along the nearest shipping lanes. The closest passed nearly 30 leagues to the east, far enough that even smoke signals would go unnoticed. He was well and truly marooned, precisely as Jenkins had intended. The thought of his former first mate sent a pulse of rage through Blackwood's chest. 23 years Jenkins had sailed under his command. 23 years breaking bread together, sharing rum beneath starlit skies, fighting back-to-back against Spanish soldiers. Patience, Blackwood reminded himself. The sea claims all debts eventually. Rising stiffly, he surveyed his surroundings. 7 days had passed since his arrival. The crude shelter he'd constructed against the rock face had already weathered one vicious storm. Not bad workmanship for a man more accustomed to giving orders than carrying them out. The river provided clean water and occasional fish. The strange fruit trees yielded enough sustenance to keep him alive, though they left his stomach growling. He would need to fashion proper tools, proper weapons, if he hoped to improve his situation. Blackwood had spent the morning exploring further inland, where the terrain gradually flattened into a fertile valley. The island was larger than he'd initially estimated, perhaps 3 miles at its widest point, 5 from north to south. Plenty of space for one man to lose himself or build something. The thought surprised him. Build what, exactly? A signal fire? A more substantial shelter? To what purpose? The world believed Captain Elias Blackwood drowned at sea, a fitting end to a blood-stained legend. Perhaps it was better that way. Still, his hands itched for occupation. Enforced idleness had always been his personal hell. That afternoon, Blackwood set about constructing fishing spears from straight branches and sharpened stones. The technique was crude, one he'd learned from natives in the Carolinas decades earlier. As he worked, his mind drifted to those early days, before he'd commanded his own ship. When the world still held wonder rather than merely opportunity, he'd been an able seaman then. Aboard the Merry Maid, learning every aspect of seamanship with hungry enthusiasm. Captain Harrison had recognized his potential, gradually entrusting him with greater responsibilities. When Harrison fell to Spanish cannons off Hispaniola, it was Blackwood who rallied the crew. Blackwood, who captured the Spanish galleon that had just claimed their captain's life, his first command, baptized in blood and fire. How many ships had followed? How many lives taken? How much treasure seized, spent, or buried in forgotten coves? Blackwood tested the balance of his newly fashioned spear. Not perfect, but it would serve. Tomorrow he would try his hand at fishing the deeper pools he'd discovered upstream, where shadowy forms suggested larger prey. The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in impossible hues of orange and purple. Despite everything, Blackwood found himself appreciating the view. When did he last pause to watch a sunset? Truly watch it, not merely note its tactical implications for navigation or attack. As darkness settled over the island, Blackwood stoked his small fire and added branches to sustain it through the night. The flames cast dancing shadows across the rocky overhang that sheltered him. In their movement he sometimes glimpsed faces, his mother gone 40 years now. Harrison, blood streaming from his temple as he pressed his captain's whistle into Blackwood's palm. The governor's daughter in Port Royal, who'd offered him respectability before he chose the black flag instead. So many crossroads, so many choices that had led him here, to this forsaken place at the edge of the world. Blackwood settled back against the stone wall, drawing his coat tightly around his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to ensure his survival. For tonight it was enough that he had lived another day. One more day than Jenkins had planned for him. The leather-bound book lay open on Blackwood's makeshift table, a flat rock positioned beneath his shelter's crude roof. Its pages were worn thin from countless readings, the margins filled with annotations in multiple inks spanning decades. Articles of Agreement, read the heading on the first page, followed by 16 rules that had governed life aboard the Raven's Revenge. Blackwood ran his fingers across Rule 7. Any man who betrays the crew shall be marooned with a pistol, 1 shot and a bottle of water. Punishment he'd meted out 3 times in his career. A mercy, he'd called it then. And here I am, he muttered, without even the pistol. 20 days had passed since the sea delivered him to this island. His shelter had evolved from a simple lean-to into a more substantial structure. Palm fronds, layered densely atop a framework of branches, kept the rain at bay. Stones, carefully stacked along the rear wall, radiated heat from the evening fire well into the night. Not comfortable by any measure, but functional, like everything else in his nascent island existence. Blackwood closed the codebook and tucked it into the hollow beneath his bedding. Sleep would not come easily tonight. It never did when memories surfaced unbidden. The Portuguese merchantman appeared in his dreams again, the Estrela do Mar, its holds laden with Brazilian gold. He'd ordered no quarter that day, impatient for the prize. The sailors had fought bravely for civilians, too bravely. His boatswain had taken a musket ball to the throat. In retaliation, Blackwood had personally executed the merchant captain and his officers, then put the ship to the torch with its remaining crew chained below decks. Their screams still echoed across 20 years. He woke with the dawn, sweat-soaked despite the cool morning air. Without pausing for breakfast, Blackwood set about his day's labor, a routine that had become his anchor against the pull of dark memories. The past week had seen considerable progress. He'd fashioned crude but effective tools, a hammerstone, chisels from harder rock, cordage from plant fibers that, while not as strong as proper rope, served adequately for binding. His shelter now featured a raised sleeping platform that kept him off the damp ground. A stone-lined fire pit allowed for more controlled cooking. Foraging paths through the jungle interior yielded increasing knowledge of the island's resources. Today's task, improving his water storage. The frequent rains provided ample fresh water, but the dry spells between left him rationing carefully. He'd begun hollowing a large section of fallen tree trunk to create a cistern, a back-breaking job with improvised tools. As he worked, sweat streaming down his face, Blackwood found himself oddly content. The simple physicality of survival demanded his complete attention, leaving little space for the ghosts that had haunted his more comfortable existence. Here each accomplishment, no matter how small, carried tangible reward. Success meant living another day. Failure meant death, clean. Simple, unlike the convoluted morality of his former life. By midday, the cistern was taking shape. Blackwood paused to drink from his coconut shell cup, surveying his modest domain. From this vantage point near his shelter, he could see the sweep of the bay where he'd washed ashore, and the protective reef beyond, that kept larger ships at bay. Further inland, jungle-covered hills rose toward the island's mountainous spine. His territory now earned through persistence rather than bloodshed. The irony was not lost on him. For decades, he had commanded men who jumped at his word, who killed and died at his command. He had claimed islands and coves and treasure through violence and intimidation. Yet none of those conquests had required him to truly work, to build with his own hands. Perhaps this was fitting justice, that he, who had taken so much, should now be reduced to creating rather than conquering. As the sun began to set, Blackwood returned to his shelter, carefully tending the fire to life. Tonight, he would add another improvement, a reflecting wall of stacked stones behind the fire pit to direct more heat into his sleeping area. Small comforts, Small accomplishments. Small redemptions, if such a thing were possible for a man with his history. Blackwood glanced toward his bedding. Knowing the codebook lay beneath, its rules rendered meaningless in this solitary existence. Perhaps it was time for new articles of agreement, a pact with himself, with this island, with whatever years remained to him. The gold doubloon caught the morning light, its worn surface still bearing the faint likeness of King Philip V of Spain. Blackwood turned the coin between his fingers, the last of his fortune, overlooked in a hidden pocket when the mutineers stripped him of his possessions. 1 gold piece, a king's ransom to a starving man, worthless trinket on an uninhabited island, 42 days since the sea had delivered him here. 42 days of reinvention. His morning routine had become almost sacred in its precision. Wake at first light. Check the fish traps in the river. Tend the small garden plot where he'd transplanted promising edible plants. Inspect the cistern and rain catchments. Maintain tools and shelter. Each day built upon the previous, each small improvement making survival less tenuous. Blackwood tucked the coin away and rose from his sleeping platform. The shelter had evolved considerably. Walls of woven branches, plastered with clay from the riverbank, kept the wind at bay. The roof, triple-layered with broad leaves and palm fronds, remained watertight even during the fiercest downpours. A separate cooking area reduced smoke in his sleeping quarters. Not luxury by any measure, but a far cry from the desperate lean-to of his first weeks. At the river, he found 2 fish in his wicker trap, adequate for the day's protein. The garden yielded a handful of starchy roots and several ripe fruits he'd come to rely upon. His knowledge of the island's bounty expanded weekly. Which berries caused stomach cramps, which leaves could soothe sunburn, which woods burned longest. By midday, the more urgent tasks completed, Blackwood turned to his ongoing project, expanding the clearing around his dwelling. The jungle seemed determined to reclaim any space not actively defended. The process was meditative in its simplicity. Cut, clear, burn. Over and over, gradually pushing back the wilderness. As he worked, Blackwood found himself speaking aloud, a habit that had developed to ward off the crushing silence. Jenkins would laugh himself sick seeing me now, he told a particularly stubborn root. The great Captain Blackwood, reduced to gardening, yet there was satisfaction in the work that surprised him. Creation rather than destruction, building rather than plundering. The sweat on his brow earned through honest labor rather than violence. When had piracy lost its savor? When had the thrill of the chase, the rush of boarding action begun to feel hollow? Certainly years before the mutiny, though he'd never acknowledged it openly. Perhaps after the incident with the Spanish treasure fleet, when he'd lost 30 men to gain a fortune that brought no joy. Or perhaps after Martinique, when he'd watched a port town burn, knowing the fire had spread beyond the military targets to claim innocent lives. Enough, he grunted, returning to the present moment. Dwelling on the past changed nothing. As afternoon waned, Blackwood climbed to his lookout point, a rocky promontory offering views of the surrounding sea. No canvas broke the perfect blue horizon. No smoke suggested passing ships. Just endless ocean in all directions. This had become another ritual, the daily confirmation of his solitude. At first, he'd watched for sails with desperate hope, then with conflicted dread. Now he observed the empty waters with something approaching acceptance. What awaited him in civilization anyway? The colonies would hang him without trial. His former crew would finish what they'd started if they learned he survived. The few ports where he might find refuge had likely forgotten him already. Dead men paid no bribes, commanded no respect. As dusk approached, Blackwood descended to his camp. The evening routine unfolded with practiced efficiency, banking the cooking fire, securing food stores from scavenging creatures, preparing torches for the night. Seated before the glowing embers, he withdrew the gold doubloon once more. Its weight felt different now, a relic from another life rather than a talisman of his former identity. To Captain Elias Blackwood, he said softly, raising an imaginary glass. May he rest uneasily at the bottom of the sea. The coin glinted in the firelight, and Blackwood made his decision. Tomorrow he would bury it, not as treasure to be reclaimed, but as a symbolic interment of the man he had been. Tomorrow marked the beginning of his second month on the island. Perhaps it was time to consider that this place might not be merely a temporary prison, but his final home. Time to build accordingly. The ship's bell rang out across the beach, its dull tones startling a flock of seabirds into flight. Blackwood stood ankle-deep in foaming surf, the heavy bronze object cradled in his arms like a child. 3 months on the island, and the sea had finally offered up a gift of genuine value. The storm had raged for 2 days, confining him to his shelter as winds howled and rain lashed the island with biblical fury. When skies finally cleared this morning, Blackwood had ventured to the western shoreline, a rocky, treacherous stretch he rarely visited, to assess any damage to the landscape. Instead, he'd found the scattered remains of a merchant vessel dashed against the outer reef. Most of the wreckage was unreachable, but the changing tide had delivered smaller pieces to shore. The bell was merely the most dramatic of his salvage. Blackwood dragged a makeshift travois laden with his findings: iron nails, lengths of rope still usable despite their soaking, a sea chest containing sodden but salvageable clothing, a crate of tools that nearly brought tears to his eyes, chisels, a handsaw with 3 interchangeable blades, a proper hammer, civilization's implements, washed up like divine providence. No survivors, though. The reef around this side of the island would make short work of any ship caught unawares by a storm. The thought sobered him. Once he might have seen such a wreck as an opportunity for plunder, giving little thought to the souls lost. Now he found himself wondering about the men aboard, their names, their families, whether they died quickly or suffered in their final moments. Blackwood set the bell down at his camp, his mind already cataloguing possibilities. With proper tools, he could improve his shelter immeasurably. With nails and the salvaged wood, he might construct furniture, storage containers, even a proper door. The sailcloth fragments could become additional rain catches or windbreaks. As he sorted through his newfound treasures, a realization struck him with unexpected force. For the first time since washing ashore, he felt something beyond mere determination to survive. He felt purpose, excitement even. That evening by firelight, Blackwood sketched plans in the sandy floor of his shelter, not just improvements to his existing structure, but something more ambitious, a proper dwelling with separate rooms, rainwater storage integrated into the design, a workshop area for crafting tools and implements. Not a temporary refuge, but a home. The thought should have depressed him. Accepting this island as his permanent residence meant surrendering any hope of return to the wider world, any chance of vengeance against Jenkins and the mutineers. Instead, he felt a curious lightening of his spirit, as though setting aside those ambitions had removed a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its presence. "You've gone soft, old man," he muttered, but without real conviction. In the following days, Blackwood threw himself into work with an energy that belied his 60 years. The ship's tools transformed tasks that had once required days into matters of hours. The handsaw made quick work of branches that he'd previously had to painstakingly cut with sharpened stone. The hammer and salvaged nails allowed for joinery that actually held firm. He'd chosen a new location for his expanded dwelling, a gentle rise overlooking the bay, offering better drainage during rainstorms and a commanding view of any approaching vessels. Though he'd seen none in his 3 months, the possibility remained that someday sails might appear on the horizon. This thought produced conflicted emotions. Part of him still yearned for rescue, for return to a world of conversation and companionship. Yet another part, growing stronger by the day, cherished the solitude, the simplicity of this existence where each day's worth was measured in tangible accomplishment rather than plunder or reputation. What would he do if a ship did appear? Signal frantically for rescue? Hide in the island's interior until they departed? He had no answer. As dusk approached on the 5th day after discovering the wreckage, Blackwood paused in his labors to regard what he'd accomplished. The foundation of his new dwelling was taking shape, a rectangle of flat stones, carefully placed to support the wooden framework he'd begin tomorrow. Nearby, salvaged timber was sorted by size and purpose, nails organized in a coconut shell, tools wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from rust. The ship's bell stood at the center of his worksite, mounted on a wooden post he'd erected as his first proper act of construction. Not for any practical purpose, but as a marker, a beginning. Blackwood reached out and gave the bell a gentle push, letting its voice roll out across the island once more. A requiem for the dead, perhaps, or an announcement of something new taking shape. The carpenter's tools lay arranged with meticulous care on the square of sailcloth, each implement cleaned, oiled, and positioned precisely. Blackwood ran calloused fingers over the worn wooden handles, familiarizing himself with their balance and heft. A shipwright's treasures, rescued from the hungry sea. Old Jameson would approve, he murmured. Picking up a finely crafted joiner's plane, memories surfaced unbidden. Jameson, the Raven's Revenge's carpenter, hunched over his workbench in the bowels of the ship, patiently showing a much younger Blackwood how to read the grain of wood, how to shape rather than force it. "The wood will tell you what it wants to be, Captain," he'd say in that gravelly Belfast accent. "Our job is just to help it along." Blackwood had valued Jameson beyond measure, not for his fighting prowess, but for his ability to keep their vessels seaworthy through battle and storm alike. The old carpenter had died peacefully in his hammock 5 years before the mutiny, one of the few men under Blackwood's command to meet a natural end. Now, those lessons would serve a different purpose. 4 months on the island, and Blackwood's ambitions grew daily. The foundation of his new dwelling was complete. A raised platform of flat stones, carefully fitted together, sloped subtly for drainage. The framework of the walls now stood, lashed together with salvaged rope and wooden pegs he'd crafted himself. Today's task: fashioning proper window frames for the eastern wall. Not merely functional openings, but carefully crafted frames with shutters that could be secured against storms yet allow the refreshing trade winds to flow through during fair weather. Blackwood selected the draw knife from his collection and set to work shaping a length of driftwood into a sill, the rhythmic motion drawing the blade toward himself. Peeling away curls of wood to reveal the smooth surface beneath brought an unexpected peace. How strange that he, who had once commanded men to slaughter and plunder, should find satisfaction in such simple creation. By midday, the first window frame was taking shape. Blackwood paused to wipe sweat from his brow, surveying his work with critical eyes. Not perfect, his joinery lacked Jameson's precision, but solid and true. It would serve. A flash of memory, standing in the governor's mansion in Nassau, admiring the fine woodwork around doors and windows. The governor himself nervously offering refreshments, desperate to placate the notorious pirate whose fleet controlled the surrounding waters. Blackwood had accepted the man's hospitality while silently calculating the ransom such a dignitary might command. He shook his head, dispelling the image. That man felt increasingly like a stranger, someone whose motivations and desires he recognized but no longer shared. The afternoon brought steady progress on the second window. As Blackwood worked, he found himself planning further improvements. A stone hearth for cooking and warmth during rainy season. Shelves for storage, perhaps even a crude chair where he might sit comfortably in the evenings. Settling in for the duration, are we? He asked himself wryly. The question no longer carried the sting it once had. Whatever fate awaited him beyond this island, justice, vengeance, or continued obscurity, seemed increasingly remote compared to the immediate reality of the life he was building here. By sunset, both window frames were complete. Tomorrow would bring the challenge of installing them properly, ensuring they sat square within the wall framework. A complex task, but not beyond his growing capabilities. Blackwood carefully wrapped each tool in oiled cloth before returning it to the sea chest he'd repurposed as a toolbox. These implements were more precious than gold now, the means by which he would transform this island from prison to home. As darkness settled over the camp, Blackwood leaned against a support post of his half-built dwelling, regarding the day's work with quiet satisfaction. The structure taking shape before him represented something he'd never before attempted in 60 years of life: creation without destruction, building without taking. The old ship's bell gleamed dully in the fading light. On impulse, Blackwood walked over and rang it once, not the doleful toll he'd used to mark the passing of the shipwrecked sailors, but a clear, purposeful note that echoed across the darkening landscape, a declaration, perhaps, or a promise. The island hadn't yet revealed all its secrets or challenges, but for the first time since the sea had delivered him to these shores, Blackwood felt something beyond resignation or mere determination to survive. He felt possibility. The signal tower stood atop the island's highest accessible point, a masterpiece of improvised engineering. 40 feet of interlocked branches formed a sturdy framework, while a platform near the summit held a carefully arranged pyre of resinous wood that would produce thick black smoke visible for miles when ignited. A system of ladders allowed access to each level, and a small shelter at the base housed dry tinder and flint. Blackwood regarded his creation with mixed emotions. 6 months of isolation had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The question that had plagued him during construction remained unanswered. Did he actually want to be rescued? His dwelling below in the valley had progressed from crude shelter to comfortable home. Stone walls rose chest-high, supporting a framework of timber salvaged from the shipwreck and the island's own resources. The roof, tightly woven palm fronds layered over a wooden understructure, kept out even the most determined tropical downpours. Windows with functioning shutters allowed for control of airflow. A stone hearth with a cleverly designed chimney provided warmth and cooking facilities. Inside, he'd crafted rudimentary furniture, a bed frame raised off the ground, a table and stool, storage shelves for his growing collection of useful items. Not luxury by any measure, but far beyond mere survival. Beyond the dwelling, other improvements transformed his corner of the island. A series of irrigation channels directed rainwater from the hills to his expanding garden plots. Stone-lined fire pits allowed for smoking meat and fish. Drying racks preserved fruit for the increasingly rare occasions when hunting and fishing proved unsuccessful. Blackwood had become not merely a survivor, but a creator, a builder of systems and structures that supported increasingly comfortable existence. So why build this tower? Why create the means to end his isolation? Perhaps, he reflected, watching seabirds circle the tower's summit, it was merely habit, the instinct for self-preservation demanding all possible options remain open. Perhaps it was acknowledgement that, despite his growing competence, one serious injury could spell his doom without outside assistance. Or perhaps it was simple recognition that humans were not meant for perpetual solitude. Though he'd never been a particularly social man, even by pirate standards, Blackwood occasionally found himself talking aloud simply to hear a human voice. Sometimes he caught himself straining to hear phantom conversations carried on the wind, ghostly, echoes of the shipboard banter that had formed the backdrop to most of his adult life. The signal tower represented possibility, rescue, return to civilization, human connection. Whether he would ever use it remained uncertain. Blackwood descended carefully, making mental notes of improvements for his next visit. The southeastern support needed reinforcement against the prevailing winds. The ladder to the upper platform had a loose rung requiring attention. Small details, but potentially crucial if urgent need for the tower ever arose. As he walked the now familiar path back to his dwelling, Blackwood's thoughts turned to the future. With basic survival needs addressed, larger ambitions had begun to form. A proper dock in the protected cove would allow for construction of a small fishing vessel. Expanded gardens could support more varied crops. Perhaps a system to capture rainwater directly from his roof, rather than relying solely on the stream. The island offered limited but adequate resources for a single inhabitant with patience and ingenuity. Its isolation, once a punishment, increasingly felt like protection. Here he answered to no authority but nature itself. Here his past remained just that, past. Evening found Blackwood at his table, using charcoal from the cooking fire to sketch plans on a smoothed piece of bark. A water wheel had taken shape in his mind, a means to harness the stream's energy for tasks more complex than simple irrigation. The technical challenges energized rather than daunted him. Problems requiring solutions, puzzles awaiting cleverness. So different from the straightforward brutality that had characterized his former profession. As darkness settled, Blackwood stepped outside to observe his signal tower, now just a darker shadow against the night sky, its potential unfulfilled. From this distance, it resembled nothing so much as the mainmast of a ship, a comparison that stirred complex emotions. The sea had been his home for most of his life. The rhythmic creaking of timber, the snap of canvas catching wind, the horizon always beckoning with promise of new conquests. These had been the constants in a life otherwise defined by violence and impermanence. Now, solid ground beneath his feet. Walls that didn't sway with tide and current. A garden that repaid care with sustenance. Unfamiliar constants, yet increasingly comfortable ones. Blackwood turned away from the distant tower and its unanswered question. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, new opportunities to build rather than destroy. For tonight, that certainty was enough. The water wheel turned steadily in the stream, each rotation a triumph of persistence over limitation. Blackwood watched with undisguised satisfaction as the crude mechanism performed its function, lifting water from the stream into a series of bamboo channels that carried irrigation to his expanding garden plots, without requiring his constant attention. Not beautiful by any measure, the wheel itself consisted of mismatched planks salvaged from the shipwreck, while cups fashioned from hollowed coconut shells caught the water on each revolution, but undeniably effective. The steady click-splash provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the usual island sounds of wind and waves. 8 months of isolation had transformed both Blackwood and his corner of the island. His initial shelter had evolved into a proper dwelling with multiple rooms, a main living area centered around the hearth, a separate sleeping chamber, and a covered workspace, where he crafted tools and planned further improvements. Stone pathways connected the structure to the garden, the stream, and the smokehouses, where he preserved fish and occasionally meat from the wild pigs he'd discovered in the island's interior. More significant than these physical changes was the transformation in Blackwood himself. The desperate castaway had become a deliberate builder. The man who had once taken pride in destruction now found satisfaction in creation. Hands that had wielded cutlass and pistol now shaped wood, stone, and earth with growing skill. Memories of his previous life surfaced with decreasing frequency and diminishing power. The betrayal that had delivered him to these shores no longer fueled dreams of revenge. Instead, it increasingly seemed a harsh but necessary intervention of fate, a forced retirement from a life that had lost its savor long before he'd acknowledged the fact. Blackwood adjusted one of the bamboo channels, correcting its flow. Water management had become a primary focus in recent weeks. The island's rainfall patterns revealed themselves as less predictable than he'd initially believed. Periods of abundance alternated with concerning dry spells. Capturing, storing, and distributing water efficiently could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving. During the drier months, hence the water wheel, his most ambitious construction to date, he'd seen similar mechanisms. In the sugar plantations of Barbados and the mills of colonial America, the basic principle seemed simple enough: harness the energy of flowing water to perform work. His version remained primitive compared to those elaborate systems, but the principles were sound. Already he envisioned improvements: larger water storage, additional channels, perhaps eventually power for a small mill to grind the wild grains he'd discovered. As Blackwood walked the path back to his dwelling, he reflected on the curious peace he'd found in this exile. For most of his life, satisfaction had come from conquest. The thrill of a successful raid, the fear in merchants' eyes when they spotted his flag, the weight of captured gold. Hollow victories, he now understood. Fleeting pleasures that required constant repetition to maintain their savor. Here, satisfaction came from solved problems and tangible improvements. A repaired roof that didn't leak during storms. A garden plot that yielded increasingly abundant harvests. A water wheel that worked as intended. Achievements that built upon one another rather than resetting to emptiness after each triumph. Inside his dwelling, Blackwood added another mark to the calendar he'd scratched into the wall, a simple system of vertical lines grouped in sevens, with longer lines denoting the passing months. By his reckoning, he'd missed 2 Christmases during his time on the island. The realization prompted neither nostalgia nor regret. Traditional holidays had meant little at sea beyond an extra ration of rum for the crew. His own milestones now marked the passage of time, the completion of the roof, the first successful crop from the garden, the discovery of the pig herd, the construction of the water wheel, a personal calendar of creation rather than the arbitrary markers of civilization. Evening found Blackwood seated on a stone bench outside his dwelling, watching as the setting sun painted the western sky in impossible hues of orange and purple. In his hands, a small carving took shape, a scale model of the water wheel, each detail rendered with growing skill, not for any practical purpose, but for the simple pleasure of creation. In the stream below, the actual wheel continued its steady rhythm, click-splash, like the heartbeat of this new life he'd built from the wreckage of the old. Blackwood listened, feeling a contentment that had eluded him during decades of plunder and violence. The wheel turned. The water flowed. The garden grew. Simple truths that contained their own profound wisdom. The figurehead watched over the growing settlement with serene wooden eyes. Once the proud ornament of a Spanish merchant vessel, the carved woman with flowing hair now stood at the entrance to Blackwood's domain, not as a conquest or trophy, but as something between guardian and companion. Blackwood had discovered her 3 weeks ago, half buried in sand, after a particularly violent storm had shifted the underwater wreckage near the reef. Hauling the massive oak carving back to his settlement had required 2 days of exhausting labor and ingenious use of log rollers. Restoring her had occupied his evening hours since, carefully removing barnacles, replacing rotted sections with fresh wood, applying protective oils rendered from native plants. He'd placed her facing the sea, as though watching for approaching vessels, though none had appeared in the year since his arrival on these shores. "Keeping an eye out, Constance?" he asked, patting the wooden shoulder as he passed. Naming the figurehead had seemed natural, though Blackwood couldn't say precisely why he'd chosen Constance, perhaps for the constancy she represented, a silent presence that neither judged nor demanded. Unlike the flesh and blood women who had briefly passed through his former life, his settlement had expanded considerably during the past months. What had begun as a single dwelling now resembled a small compound. The main house remained at the center, its stone walls now plastered with a mixture of clay and crushed shells that gleamed almost white in the sunlight. Around it, smaller structures served specific purposes: a smokehouse for preserving meat and fish, a workshop for crafting tools and furniture, a storage building for harvested crops. Connecting these buildings, stone pathways provided firm footing even during the heaviest rains. Carefully placed drainage channels directed water away from the structures and toward the cisterns he'd constructed to capture every precious drop. The garden plots had expanded to include not just edible plants, but herbs and flowers that added flavor and color to his increasingly sophisticated meals. The overall effect was no longer that of desperate survival, but of deliberate design, a place built for sustained habitation rather than mere existence. Today's task involved expanding the perimeter wall that enclosed the main compound. Not that he had encountered any predators large enough to threaten a grown man, but the wall served multiple purposes, defining his territory, blocking the strongest winds during storms, supporting climbing plants that provided both beauty and additional food. Blackwood worked methodically, placing stones in the pattern he'd developed through trial and error, larger rocks forming the outer faces while smaller stones filled the interior space. No mortar joined them. Instead, careful fitting and balanced pressure kept the structure stable. The technique resembled those he'd observed in ancient walls during raids on Mediterranean islands, though his execution lacked their refined precision. As he worked, his mind wandered to memories of those distant shores, Sicily, Sardinia, Cyprus, places where ancient civilizations had left their mark in stone and philosophy alike. He'd visited them not as scholar or admirer, but as predator seeking prey. How much beauty and wisdom had he overlooked in his single-minded pursuit of treasure? The wall grew steadily throughout the morning. By midday, Blackwood paused to wipe sweat from his brow and survey his progress. Another 20 feet completed, with perhaps twice that remaining before this section would connect with the existing wall. Satisfactory progress. He turned to find Constance's wooden gaze fixed upon him, her expression one of perpetual calm. The craftsman who had carved her had imbued the wood with remarkable serenity, a quality that stood in stark contrast to the violent history of the ship she had once adorned. "What would you have thought of me in my former glory?" he asked the silent figure. "Captain Blackwood, terror of the Spanish Main. Would you have found me impressive, I wonder? Or merely another brute playing at importance?" No answer came, of course, but the question itself revealed how far he had traveled from the man who had washed ashore on this island. That Blackwood would never have spared thought for a wooden woman's opinion, would never have expended precious energy salvaging a mere ornament, would never have found satisfaction in the peaceful creation of walls and gardens. That evening, Blackwood sat outside his dwelling, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. From this vantage point, he could see the full extent of what he'd built over the past year, a small kingdom carved from wilderness through persistence and adaptability. Not impressive by civilized standards, perhaps, but entirely his own creation. Near the entrance, Constance's silhouette stood in stark relief against the twilight sky, a solitary figure keeping watch while he rested. Tomorrow would bring more work, more improvements, more small victories against the limitations of his circumstances. For tonight, it was enough to sit in the quiet gathering darkness, surrounded by the tangible results of his labor, at peace with the silence. The fishing nets hung from wooden frames to dry in the afternoon sun, an intricate lattice of plant fibers and salvaged rope that represented weeks of patient labor. Blackwood inspected his handiwork critically, testing knots and reinforcing sections that showed signs of wear. Good craftsmanship meant the difference between feast and famine, when the seas grew turbulent and hunting on the island proved unproductive. 15 months since the sea had delivered him to these shores. 15 months of transformation, both of the island and himself. The fishing nets symbolized this evolution more clearly than perhaps any other creation. In his former life, Blackwood had taken what he needed at sword point, demanding tribute from those who had earned their living through honest labor. Now he crafted tools that allowed him to harvest the sea's bounty without depleting it, taking only what he required while ensuring future abundance. He'd learned proper net-making from a Portuguese fisherman captured during a raid on a small coastal village. Rather than executing the man as his crew had expected, Blackwood had kept him aboard for nearly a month, extracting knowledge rather than blood. The fisherman had eventually been released unharmed at the next port, a rare act of mercy that had confused Blackwood's crew but provided skills that now proved invaluable. "You'd appreciate the irony." "Old man," Blackwood murmured, thinking of that weathered fisherman whose name he could no longer recall. His settlement had evolved into a model of self-sufficiency. The expanded garden plots now included not just edible plants, but fiber crops specifically cultivated for making cordage and nets. Stone-lined pools near the shore served as temporary holding areas for live fish, allowing him to keep his catch fresh until needed and release any excess back to the sea. Nearby, a series of drying racks held fish in various stages of preservation. Some were simply salted and dried in the sun. Others smoked over carefully tended fires of aromatic wood. Still others preserved in oil within sealed clay pots of his own making. Each method yielded different flavors and storage properties, variety that made his isolated existence more palatable. Blackwood lifted one of the smaller nets, testing its balance before folding it carefully for storage. Tomorrow, he would take the outrigger canoe he'd constructed to the southern lagoon, where schools of silver fish gathered during the incoming tide. The craft itself represented another triumph of patience and adaptability, built from island timber and salvage materials, its design inspired by similar vessels he'd observed in the South Pacific during his voyaging years. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to those distant days, commanding the Raven's revenge through uncharted waters, seeking prizes among the rich trading vessels of the East India Company. The thrill of the chase, the terror in merchant captains' eyes when they spotted his flag, the satisfying weight of plundered gold. Such memories now seemed to belong to another man entirely, a stranger whose motivations Blackwood recognized but no longer shared. The captain, who had terrorized shipping lanes, would never have found satisfaction in crafting fishing nets or tending gardens. That man had measured worth in fear inspired and treasures seized, not in sustenance honestly acquired. The transformation had been gradual yet profound. Necessity had initially driven him to these pursuits, the basic imperative of survival requiring food, shelter, tools. But somewhere along the way, necessity had yielded to something deeper, appreciation for the dignity inherent in providing for oneself through skill and labor rather than force and intimidation. Evening found Blackwood seated at his workbench, carefully inserting shell weights along the bottom edge of his newest net. The lamplight, rendered from rendered animal fat in a clay vessel of his own making, cast warm illumination across weathered hands that moved with practiced precision. Outside, the settlement rested in peaceful twilight. Pathways swept clean, tools stored in their proper places, smokehouse fires banked to smolder through the night. Order imposed upon wilderness not through violence, but through persistent, thoughtful effort. Blackwood completed his task and stepped outside to observe the night sky, a vast celestial map that had once guided his ship through treacherous waters and now simply marked the passing of seasons. In his island existence, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the transformation that had occurred beneath their eternal gaze. Captain Blackwood, scourge of shipping lanes, had washed away with the tide that had delivered him here. In his place stood simply Blackwood, the builder, the grower, the provider, a man who sustained life rather than taking it. Tomorrow would bring the simple satisfaction of casting his nets into the lagoon's clear waters, not to conquer or claim, but to participate in the ancient exchange between human skill and natural abundance. An honest transaction, purchased with labor rather than blood. The memorial stones stood in a half-circle on the windswept promontory overlooking the sea. 37 markers of varying heights, each bearing a name painstakingly carved into its surface. Some represented men who had fallen under Blackwood's command. Others commemorated those who had died by his hand or by his orders. Not all the names, certainly. There were too many for that. But those that had lingered most persistently in his memory during the long nights of his exile. 4 years had transformed both the island and its solitary inhabitant. What had begun as a simple shelter was now a complex compound that resembled nothing so much as a small, well-ordered village built for one. Stone buildings arranged around a central courtyard, covered walkways, providing shelter during sudden tropical downpours. a system of cisterns and channels that captured rainwater and distributed it efficiently throughout the settlement. Gardens that yielded not just sustenance, but beauty, with flowering plants interspersed among the practical crops. Blackwood knelt before the newest stone, adding the final strokes to the name, Miguel Vargas, captain of the Santa Catalina, a worthy adversary who had fought bravely to defend his ship and crew before falling to Blackwood's blade. That had been, 15 years ago, 16? Time blurred the details, but not the man's face in his final moments. "Rest easy, Captain," Blackwood murmured, running calloused fingers over the freshly carved letters. "Your courage is remembered here, if nowhere else." The memorial had begun 2 years earlier, after a particularly vivid dream, in which faces from his past had appeared one by one, silent and accusing. Upon waking, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air, Blackwood had understood what needed to be done. Not atonement, no simple act could balance that cosmic ledger, but acknowledgement at least. Recognition of the lives that had intersected with his, often with tragic consequences. He visited the memorial weekly, weather permitting, to maintain the site and occasionally add new stones as memories surfaced. The ritual had taken on importance beyond mere remembrance. These quiet moments of reflection marked his severance from the man he had been, a man who had valued human life only when it served his purposes or posed a threat to his ambitions. The afternoon sun cast long shadows behind the standing stones as Blackwood rose and surveyed his handiwork. Though crude by comparison to the ornate monuments of European cemeteries, the memorial possessed a stark dignity that seemed fitting. These were not heroes being honored, after all, nor were they all innocents unjustly slain. They were simply men whose paths had crossed his own during a lifetime of violence and plunder. As Blackwood walked the familiar path back to his settlement, his mind turned to the future rather than the past. Recent weeks had seen him considering expansions to the harbor area where his single outrigger canoe now rested. The natural cove offered protection from the worst storms and could, with proper development, accommodate larger vessels. Not that he expected visitors. In 4 years, not a single sail had appeared on the horizon. Confirming what his salvaged nautical charts had suggested, this island lay well away from established shipping routes, its treacherous surrounding reefs discouraging casual exploration. Yet the impulse to improve the harbor persisted, as though some part of him anticipated a future beyond solitude. Strange how the human mind insisted on planning for possibilities rather than probabilities. His settlement came into view as he rounded the final bend in the path, the whitewashed walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun, smoke rising from the cooking hearth where fish would be roasting for his evening meal. The sight never failed to inspire a complex emotion somewhere between pride and melancholy. Pride in what he had created from nothing. Melancholy that there was no one to share it with. Constance, the figurehead, still stood watch at the entrance, her wooden features weathered by 4 years of sun and rain, despite Blackwood's regular applications of protective oils. He nodded to her as he passed, a habit formed during long months of isolation when the carved figure represented his only semblance of company. Inside the courtyard, evidence of his latest project lay scattered across the workspace. Sketches on bark paper showing designs for an improved dock, piles of cut timber seasoning in the sun, coils of rope crafted from island fibers. Always another project, another improvement. Without such purposes, isolation would have driven him to madness long ago. As he prepared his evening meal, Blackwood found himself contemplating the memorial stones and what they represented, not just personal ghosts laid to rest, but a larger question that had increasingly occupied his thoughts. Could a place built by blood-stained hands eventually serve a greater purpose than mere exile or penance? Could this island, developed through his labor and protected by its natural isolation, someday become a haven for others seeking escape from the world's cruelties? Not now, perhaps not in his lifetime, but eventually. The possibility lingered like the setting sun's afterglow as darkness settled over the island. The leather-bound journal lay open on Blackwood's workbench, its pages filled with neat script that belied the weathered hands that produced it. Salvaged from the sea chest that had washed ashore during his second year on the island, the book had initially served as a simple record of daily events, weather patterns, successful plantings, construction milestones. Gradually, it had evolved into something more profound, a blueprint for a different kind of existence. Governance without coercion, Blackwood read aloud from his most recent entry. Is such a thing possible? The natural state of men seems to trend toward dominance and submission. Yet here I have found balance without these corrupting influences. 5 years of solitude had clarified certain truths that had eluded him during decades of command. As captain, he had maintained discipline through fear and occasional brutality, believing it the only means of controlling the volatile mix of desperate men under his authority. Yet his solitary society of one functioned perfectly, well without threat of punishment or promise of reward beyond the natural. Consequences of action or inaction, Blackwood dipped his homemade quill into ink rendered from island berries and continued his entry. Perhaps it is not human nature that corrupts, but scarcity, real or perceived. When basic needs are met and security assured, the impulse to dominate others diminishes. The question becomes, can such conditions be created for more than one? The journal had become his confidant in recent months, receiving thoughts he would once have dismissed as naive or dangerously idealistic. Isolated from the corrupting influences of civilization and the harsh realities of maritime predation, his mind had wandered into territories previously unexplored, philosophical questions of justice, community, and purpose. Outside, rain fell in gentle sheets across his settlement, nourishing gardens and refilling cisterns. The sound provided soothing accompaniment to his contemplations, so different from the threatening roar of storms that had once driven his ship toward sheltered harbors. Blackwood turned to earlier pages in the journal, where detailed maps of the island revealed his growing knowledge of its resources and terrain. The eastern peninsula with its protected cove and natural harbor, the central highlands where freshwater springs emerged from volcanic rock, the western shores with their treacherous reefs that had claimed at least 2 vessels during his residency, yielding valuable salvage but no survivors. Between these geographical notations, other entries captured the island's bounty, edible plants catalogued by growing season and nutritional properties, fishing grounds mapped by tide and lunar cycle, locations of useful minerals and building materials. A comprehensive inventory of paradise, documented with the meticulous attention once reserved for planning raids on merchant shipping. Most significant were the pages devoted to his evolving vision, sketches of an expanded settlement designed not for one inhabitant but for many. A communal hall positioned to catch cooling breezes, individual dwellings arranged to provide both privacy and convenient access to shared resources, gardens scaled to feed dozens rather than a single man, potential not yet reality. Blackwood set down his quill and closed the journal, securing it with a leather strap. Outside, the rain had slackened to a gentle mist that softened the contours of his settlement. He stepped onto the covered porch that fronted his main dwelling, observing how the paths he'd laid channeled water efficiently away from buildings and toward collection points. Another lesson learned through trial and error, documented in the journal for future reference, whether his own or someone else's. The question that increasingly occupied his thoughts remained unanswered. Was this place meant to remain his private exile, or could it become something more? A haven for others seeking escape from the injustices and cruelties he had once embodied. 5 years ago, newly arrived and desperate for survival, he would have rejected such notions as foolish sentimentality. Captain Blackwood had never concerned himself with creating sanctuary, only with accumulating power and wealth. Yet that man seemed increasingly distant, a half-remembered acquaintance rather than his former self. Evening approached as the rain ceased altogether, leaving the settlement gleaming in the emerging sunlight. Blackwood walked its perimeter, noting repairs needed after the day's downpour, mentally composing tomorrow's journal entry. The simple discipline of observation and documentation had become central to his existence, a means of creating meaning from isolation. As darkness settled over the island, Blackwood returned to his dwelling and lit the oil lamp on his workbench. The journal waited, its blank pages an invitation to continue mapping, not just the physical reality of his domain, but the philosophical questions that increasingly occupied his thoughts. What kind of society might arise from the ashes of his former existence? What principles would sustain it? What lessons from his blood-soaked past might serve as warnings rather than templates? Questions without immediate answers, yet worth exploring in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. Questions that transformed exile into opportunity, isolation into clarity. The longboat rested in its newly constructed boathouse, 20 feet of salvaged timber and native hardwood, meticulously caulked with a mixture of plant fibers and natural resins. Its hull gleamed with protective oils, while carefully stitched canvas formed a serviceable sail furled neatly around the central mast. A vessel capable of coastal navigation, perhaps even reaching distant islands, if provisioned adequately. A means of escape, should Blackwood choose to use it as such. 6 years of exile had transformed the once fearsome pirate captain into a man almost unrecognizable to his former self. His beard, now more grey than black, hung halfway to his chest. His hands, once known primarily for their skill with cutlass and pistol, now bore the calluses of a builder and craftsman. His body, leaner than in his days of captaincy, yet somehow stronger, moved with the deliberate efficiency of one accustomed to accomplishing tasks without assistance. The longboat represented his most ambitious construction to date, nearly 8 months of labor interspersed between the daily requirements of survival and settlement maintenance. Every piece had been crafted by hand, from the steam-bent ribs to the hand-forged nails that secured critical joints, a triumph of patience and accumulated skill. Yet as Blackwood ran his palm along the smooth gunwale, he confronted the paradox of his creation. Having built a vessel capable of returning him to civilization, he found himself strangely reluctant to use it for that purpose. "Where would you go, old man?" he murmured to himself, a habit developed during long years of solitude. The question wasn't merely practical, but existential. The world he had left behind offered nothing but the gallows for a pirate of his notoriety, assuming any still remembered his name after 6 years. His crew, those who had survived the mutiny, would have scattered to the winds or met their own violent ends. The few ports where he might once have found safe harbor would have changed hands or allegiances multiple times in the intervening years. More significantly, he himself had changed. The man who had commanded the Raven's revenge through blood and terror would find little satisfaction in civilization's constraints or comforts. That man had died when the sea delivered his broken body to these shores. What remained, what had been reborn, through labor and solitude, belonged to this place. In ways he was only beginning to understand, Blackwood stepped out of the boathouse onto the dock he'd constructed along the protected cove on the island's eastern shore. The harbor infrastructure had expanded considerably over the past year, not just the dock, but mooring posts, navigation markers indicating safe passage through the reef, and this small signal tower that could guide vessels during daylight hours. Preparations not for his departure, but for the arrival of others. Whether by shipwreck or deliberate navigation, Blackwood had increasingly oriented his efforts toward making the island accessible and survivable for potential newcomers. The longing for human companionship, suppressed during his early years of exile, had gradually asserted itself through these practical preparations. The longboat served this vision as well, a means to rescue shipwreck survivors spotted from his watchtower, or to explore nearby waters for resources unavailable on his island. Its construction had never been solely about creating an escape route, though that possibility remained should circumstances demand it. Evening approached as Blackwood walked the familiar path back toward his main settlement. The compound had evolved into a marvel of adaptive design, structures positioned to maximize shade during the hottest hours while capturing prevailing breezes, gardens arranged for efficient harvesting and rotation, water management systems that functioned with minimal maintenance. An island kingdom built by one man's hands, guided by hard-earned wisdom. In his journal the previous night, Blackwood had written, "Freedom lies not in boundless choices, but in well-considered constraints. The sea surrounding this island once represented imprisonment. Now it forms a boundary that defines and protects what I have built." Perhaps true liberty exists in accepting such boundaries rather than perpetually seeking to escape them. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Blackwood paused at the settlement entrance, where Constance, the figurehead, still maintained her silent watch after 6 years of sun and storms. Her wooden features had weathered into something more natural than the artisan's original design, less an idealized female form and more a representation of patient endurance. "We're not going anywhere. Old girl," he told the wooden sentinel, patting her shoulder in passing. "The longboat would remain in its shelter, ready for use, but not as a means of abandoning all he had created." Its presence represented not escape, but expansion, another tool in the ongoing project of transforming exile into purpose, isolation into opportunity. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, new possibilities for improving this domain he now considered home. The wider world, with its violence and greed, could remain at a safe distance, at least for now. The harbour bell rang out across the water, its clear tone carrying far beyond the confines of the small bay. Mounted on a sturdy frame at the end of the dock, the bronze instrument had been salvaged from the same shipwreck that had yielded the carpenter's tools years earlier. Once used to mark watches aboard a merchant vessel, it now served a different purpose. Welcoming rather than warning, inviting rather than announcing, Blackwood gave the bell rope another pull, allowing the sound to roll out across the morning stillness. 7 years of exile had taught him the importance of rituals in maintaining sanity. The morning bell, rung regardless of weather or season, marked the transition from rest to activity, from darkness to possibility. The harbour had become his pride over the past year. What had begun as a simple landing place for his outrigger canoe and later his longboat now resembled a proper port facility, albeit on a modest scale. The main dock extended nearly 60 feet into the protected waters of the eastern cove, sturdy enough to accommodate vessels of significant size should any ever appear. Mooring posts stood ready at regular intervals. Smaller floating platforms provided access to the water at varying tide levels. Most significant were the navigation aids he'd established, a series of markers indicating the safe passage through the treacherous reef that surrounded most of the island. By day, distinctive shapes and colors provided visual guidance. By night, carefully positioned lanterns created a pathway of light visible from a considerable distance offshore. Not that any ships had appeared to utilize these aids. In 7 years, Blackwood had spotted distant sails on only 3 occasions, each vessel passing well beyond the horizon with no indication they'd observed the small island or its solitary inhabitant. Yet he persisted in his improvements, driven by a vision that transcended his personal circumstances. The harbour represented not just practical infrastructure, but a declaration of intent. This place was no longer merely one man's refuge, but a potential haven for others. Blackwood secured the bell rope and proceeded with his morning inspection of the harbour facilities. The tide markers needed repainting, he noted. Several mooring ropes showed concerning wear and would require replacement soon. The system of rainwater channels leading to the harbourside cistern needed clearing of debris from yesterday's brief storm. Tasks to add to his ever-present list of maintenance and improvements. After 7 years, he'd learned that creating was only half the challenge. Preserving what had been built required equal diligence. As he worked, Blackwood reflected on the latest addition to his journal, a formal codification of principles he'd developed during his years on the island. Not laws in the traditional sense, with their implicit threat of punishment, but guidelines for harmonious existence should others eventually join him in this place. Resources sufficient for need belong to all equally, he'd written. Resources beyond need belong to those who create or discover them, yet carry an obligation to the community. Simple concepts that would have seemed laughably naive to the pirate captain he'd once been, yet which had emerged organically from his years of solitude and self-sufficiency. Without the distortions of artificial scarcity and coercive hierarchy, certain truths had revealed themselves with startling clarity. By midday, Blackwood had completed the most urgent harbour repairs and moved on to his secondary project, expanding the signal tower that overlooked the eastern approaches to the island. Originally built merely to spot potential rescue, the structure now served a broader purpose as both lookout and lighthouse. When completed, the new upper platform would accommodate a larger signal fire visible from much greater distances during the night hours. An invitation to the world beyond, should any care to accept it. As afternoon waned, Blackwood took his customary position at the existing lookout platform, spyglass in hand, to survey the surrounding waters. The ritual rarely yielded notable observations, yet he maintained it faithfully, another marker in the ordered progression of his days. Today, however, the familiar routine delivered the unexpected at the very limit of visibility. A dark smudge broke the perfect line of the horizon, the distinctive silhouette of a ship under full sail. Too distant to determine size or origin, yet unmistakably human-made. Blackwood tracked its progress for nearly 30 minutes, breath caught in his throat. Before confirming it, maintained a course that would pass well clear of the island. He lowered the spyglass, surprised by the complexity of emotions the sighting evoked. Disappointment warred with relief, longing with apprehension. The world beyond still existed, still moved along its violent, chaotic course, while he remained apart from its currents, by choice now rather than circumstance. As dusk approached, Blackwood returned to the harbour and rang the bell once more, its clear tone marking the day's end as it had heralded its beginning. The distant ship had disappeared beyond the horizon, continuing to whatever destination or fate awaited it. Its island remained unvisited, his exile unbroken, yet something had changed with that distant sighting, a reminder that isolation, however complete it might seem, remained ultimately temporary. One day a ship would alter course. One day the harbour bell would ring not just as ritual but as greeting. One day his creation would be tested against the reality of human nature beyond his own. The trunk lay open on Blackwood's workbench, its brass fittings tarnished by seawater, its leather covering peeling away in places. Yet its contents largely protected by careful packing and oilcloth wrappings. A child's wooden horse with hand-painted details, a woman's ivory comb and silver-backed mirror, several books in Portuguese, their pages rippled but legible. Family treasures, not cargo. Blackwood regarded these intimate possessions with unease. Salvage had always been impersonal before, anonymous ships yielding practical materials. This was different. These belongings told a story, spoke of lives disrupted, lives that might continue, if he found their owners in time. The storm had struck without warning 3 days earlier, a savage tempest that had driven him to the refuge of his storm cellar for nearly 12 hours as wind and rain lashed the island with apocalyptic fury. When he'd finally emerged to assess damage to his settlement, the harbour bell had been ringing frantically, not driven by wind but by human hands. He'd found them huddled beneath the small shelter at the dock's end, a man, woman and 2 children, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Their ship had broken up on the reef during the storm's height. They'd escaped in the only lifeboat, guided to the harbour by his navigation markers and lanterns, survivors, the first humans Blackwood had encountered in nearly 8 years of solitude. Now, They occupied his guest house, a structure built for visitors who had never arrived until now. The man, Antonio Carreira, a Portuguese merchant bound for Brazil with his family, remained bedridden with injuries sustained during their ordeal. His wife, Maria, moved between tending her husband and keeping watch over their children, Teresa, a solemn girl of perhaps 10, and Miguel, a wide-eyed boy of 7 or 8. Their presence had shattered the carefully ordered routines of Blackwood's existence. Suddenly, his self-sufficiency extended to 4 additional souls, who regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. They accepted his food, shelter, and medical attention while maintaining a careful distance, something in his bearing or expression apparently communicating danger despite his efforts at reassurance. Perhaps it was the name, Blackwood. Antonio had repeated weakly when Blackwood introduced himself. Not Captain Elias Blackwood of the Raven's Revenge? The recognition had been unexpected, a jarring intrusion of his former identity into the sanctuary he'd built. He'd acknowledged the name without elaboration, watching as fear replaced confusion in the merchant's eyes. "We thought you dead these many years," Antonio had said. "Your ship was seen burning off Barbados. They said the Royal Navy finally caught up with you." "A misunderstanding," Blackwood had replied. The first lie he'd told in 8 years of solitude. Now, as he carefully repacked the family's salvaged belongings, Blackwood confronted uncomfortable truths. His reputation, the terror he'd once inspired across shipping lanes, remained alive in the world beyond this island. To this family, he represented not salvation, but potential threat. The pirate who had shown no mercy to countless merchant vessels now held their lives in his hands. Would they believe he'd changed? Could he blame them if they didn't? The evening meal proved a study in strained civility. Maria Carrera had insisted on cooking, despite Blackwood's assurances it wasn't necessary, perhaps needing to establish some control over their circumstances. Perhaps simply not trusting food prepared by the infamous Captain Blackwood. The children watched him with undisguised fascination throughout the meal. Teresa whispered questions to her mother in Portuguese, receiving hushed admonishments in return. Young Miguel stared openly until parental glances forced his attention back to his plate. "Your island is quite remarkable, Señor Blackwood," Maria offered carefully as they ate. "You have built all this yourself?" "Over 8 years," he confirmed, oddly pleased at the acknowledgement. "The harbor facilities are more recent additions. The navigation markers saved our lives," she said. "Without them, we would never have found safe passage through the reef." A moment of connection, however tenuous. Blackwood found himself unexpectedly moved by her recognition of his work. These markers had been created precisely for such a purpose, to guide the lost to safety, yet this was the first confirmation they had served their intended function. After the meal, as the family retired to the guest house, Blackwood remained at his table, contemplating the day's events and their implications. His isolation had ended, at least temporarily. Human complexity had intruded upon his carefully constructed simplicity. More significantly, his past had returned to confront him in the frightened eyes of a merchant family who knew his name and reputation. The man he had been now sat in judgment of the man he had become. Would his actions in the coming days confirm or contradict their fears? Could years of solitary redemption outweigh decades of notorious cruelty? As darkness settled over the island, Blackwood made his decision. When their health permitted, he would offer the Carrera family a choice: passage to the nearest port aboard his longboat, provisioned for the journey, or sanctuary on his island for as long as they required it. Their choice would reveal whether Captain Blackwood's reputation could ever truly be laid to rest. Whether the monster of legend could be redeemed in the eyes of those who had once feared his very name. The charter lay unrolled on the great table in the communal hall, its carefully inscribed principles illuminated by afternoon sunlight streaming through the open windows. Grafted from island-made parchment and bound with the seal of local beeswax, the document represented something unprecedented, a covenant between equals rather than dictates imposed by the powerful upon the weak. All who seek refuge shall find it. Blackwood read aloud to the assembled residents. All who abide by these principles shall enjoy equal protection and opportunity. No person may claim authority through force or birthright, only through service freely chosen by the community. 23 faces watched him intently, men, women, and children from a dozen nations, speaking 8 languages between them. Former slaves, disgraced merchants, religious dissidents, and shipwreck survivors, souls cast aside by the world beyond this island's sheltering reefs. Over the past 2 years, they had trickled in gradually, first as desperate refugees, then increasingly as deliberate seekers drawn by spreading rumors of the haven built by the reformed pirate. The Carrera family had been the first, choosing to remain after their recovery, and eventually sending word to trusted contacts after Blackwood's longboat delivered letters to a neutral port. Others had followed, a Dutch physician fleeing religious persecution, a family of escaped slaves from Barbados, a Scottish mapmaker whose radical political views had made him unwelcome throughout the colonies. Each arrival had expanded both the settlement's capabilities and its complexities. The Charter formally establishes what we have already been practicing, Blackwood continued, conscious of how strange it felt to address a crowd after years of solitude. But as our numbers grow, written principles become necessary to ensure consistent understanding. He gestured to Antonio Carrera, whose initial fear of the infamous pirate had gradually yielded to cautious respect and eventually partnership in developing the island's governance structure. This document reflects 2 months of discussion. Among all adult residents, Carrera added, his Portuguese accent still pronounced despite years of English conversation. Every voice has contributed. Every concern has been addressed. It is truly ours, not merely Captain Blackwood's. The title still attached to him despite his protestations, though it had gradually transformed from feared designation to term of respect. Few of the newer arrivals connected the aging, dignified builder of this sanctuary with the bloodthirsty predator who had once terrorized shipping lanes. Those who recognized his name often kept their knowledge private, perhaps sensing that bringing up the past served no useful purpose, yet the past remained ever present in Blackwood's mind, particularly on days like today, when the harbor bell rang with an urgency that signaled not welcome but warning. The messenger, a young fisherman breathless from running up from the harbor, burst into the communal hall without ceremony. 3 ships approaching from the southeast, he announced. Naval vessels flying British colors. The assembled residents exchanged worried glances. While their settlement maintained no formal allegiance to any nation, they had established cautious trade relations with merchants from several countries. Naval vessels, however, represented potential threat. Colonial powers were notorious for claiming unclaimed territories, regardless of existing inhabitants. Defensive positions, Blackwood instructed calmly. Years of command resurfacing in crisis. No provocations, but full preparedness. The residents dispersed efficiently, each moving to predetermined responsibilities developed during months of planning for such contingencies. The island's natural protections, encircling reefs that limited safe approaches, combined with strategically positioned lookouts and warning systems, to create a surprisingly effective defensive network for a pacifistic community. At the harbor, Blackwood raised his spyglass to study the approaching vessels. Their configuration was familiar, the lead ship in particular triggering memories from another lifetime. When he lowered the glass, his expression had hardened into something his former crew would have recognized all too well. "Send runners to each outpost," he instructed the harbor master. "The vessels must be allowed through the navigation markers. We cannot risk them damaging the reef by attempting unauthorized passage. But position our people at the secondary defensive points." The underlying reality remained unspoken. While the island community had constructed modest defensive capabilities, they could not hope to repel a determined naval attack. Their safety depended on negotiation rather than resistance. As the lead ship drew closer, Blackwood's suspicions solidified into certainty. He recognized the modifications to the forecastle, the distinctive figurehead, a vessel once familiar as his own reflection, the Raven's Revenge. His former flagship approached under new command, and standing at the bow, visible now without the spyglass, the unmistakable figure of Jenkins, the first mate whose betrayal had cast Blackwood adrift 10 years earlier. The man who had left him to die now sailed toward the paradise Blackwood had built from that intended death sentence. "Constance," Blackwood murmured to the weathered figurehead that still stood watch at the harbour entrance. "It seems we'll have a reunion after all." He rang the harbour bell 3 times, the signal for all residents to implement the community protection protocol. Not a plan for violent resistance, but something more nuanced. A strategy for preservation developed by a man intimately familiar with both sides of the coming confrontation. The former predator prepared to defend his flock not through violence, but through the wisdom gained from a decade of building rather than destroying. The white flag fluttered atop the harbour's tallest pole, not a symbol of surrender but a declaration of principle. Blackwood had raised it himself as the Raven's Revenge dropped anchor in the protected cove, its gun ports ominously open despite the peaceful approach. Flanking their former flagship, 2 smaller naval vessels maintained strategic positions, their crews visibly armed and watchful. "Still theatrical as ever, Jenkins," Blackwood murmured, observing the unnecessarily elaborate landing party assembling on his former ship's deck. A decade had changed both men. Jenkins, now calling himself Commodore James, had grown corpulent with success, his once wiry frame swollen with the excesses his newfound respectability afforded. The mutineer had apparently reinvented himself as a privateer under Crown sanction, his past crimes forgiven in exchange for directing his predatory skills against Britain's enemies. Blackwood, conversely, had been stripped to essentials by his years of exile. Leaner, weathered, silver-haired but straight-backed, he waited on the dock with the island's council, 5 residents elected to represent the community's diverse population. "They're flying the king's colours, but this is no official naval expedition," Blackwood explained quietly. "Jenkins was never one for legitimate authority. Then what does he want?" asked Maria Carrera, now the settlement's medical officer. "What pirates always want," Blackwood answered. "Safe harbour, supplies, and whatever else he can take." The landing party approached in 2 longboats, Jenkins in the lead vessel accompanied by heavily armed men, their weapons displayed with deliberate ostentation. As they neared the dock, Blackwood raised his hand in greeting but did not step forward. "Permission to come ashore, Captain," Jenkins called mockingly, his voice carrying across the water. "You'll find no captain here," Blackwood replied evenly. "Just residents welcoming visitors who respect our customs." Jenkins' laugh held no humour. "Still playing games, I see." He stepped onto the dock with exaggerated care, surveying the harbour and settlement beyond with appraising eyes. "When word reached me that the notorious Captain Blackwood had created a little kingdom on an uncharted island, I couldn't resist seeing for myself." "No kingdom," Blackwood corrected. "A sanctuary, one with strict principles of non-violence that we expect all visitors to honour." The implied warning hung in the air between them. Jenkins' smile tightened as he glanced at his armed escorts, clearly calculating odds and possibilities. "Your sanctuary occupies a strategically valuable location," Jenkins said finally. "His Majesty's government has authorized me to claim it for the Crown. Your people may remain as colonial subjects, of course, provided they swear allegiance." The familiar rhythm of intimidation, Blackwood had employed similar tactics dozens of times during his pirating career. The invocation of distant authority, the thin veneer of legitimacy, the implied threat beneath seemingly reasonable terms. "Perhaps you'd care to see what you're claiming before negotiations begin," Blackwood suggested, gesturing toward the settlement. Our community has certain unique features worth understanding. Curiosity, always Jenkins' weakness, won out over immediate aggression. The landing party followed Blackwood and the council through the harbour area toward the main settlement, their expressions shifting from dismissive to increasingly impressed as the tour proceeded. By design, their path led through areas highlighting the community's sophistication and self-sufficiency. The terraced gardens, where experimental crops flourished. The workshops, where skilled craftspeople from a dozen nations produced goods sought by trading vessels. The communal hall, where the charter hung prominently. The school where children of former slaves learned alongside those of European merchants. Most significantly, they passed numerous lookout points where residents casually tended gardens or worked at crafts, positions Blackwood knew Jenkins would recognize as defensive stations covering every approach to the settlement's core. You've built something remarkable, Jenkins acknowledged reluctantly when they reached the central plaza. A pity it must change hands. That's where you're mistaken, Blackwood replied, his voice pitched to carry to the gathered residents. This island belongs to no nation and no individual, not even me. It governs itself through consent and common purpose. Noble sentiments, Jenkins sneered. But cannonballs respect no principles. True, Blackwood conceded. Which is why you should know that as we toured, your ships came under new observation. He gestured subtly toward the surrounding hillsides, where small mirrors flashed in the sunlight, the community's signaling system now directed at Jenkins' vessels. The passages through the reef are marked by buoys that can be moved. Blackwood continued conversationally. Your ships found safe harbor only because we allowed it. The same reef that protects us would shred your hulls if you attempted departure through unmarked channels. The implicit threat hung in the air. Impressive because it required no violence, merely the passive withdrawal of assistance. Decades later, elderly now and white-bearded, Blackwood sat at the harbor's edge, watching trading vessels from a dozen nations unload cargo at the bustling port his sanctuary had become. The white flag still flew above the harbor, no longer a response to threat, but a permanent declaration of the island's unique status as a free port governed by its own charter rather than any imperial power. Jenkins' attempted conquest had become merely another chapter in the settlement's growing mythology. The former mutineer had departed with empty threats, but no actual violence, unwilling to risk his vessels against an opponent who understood the sea's dangers better than he did. Word had spread. The island had grown. The white flag continued to wave, not in surrender but in triumph, the enduring symbol of a place where a monster had built a haven that outlived his infamous reputation.